And now for something completely different.
Sooner or later, that soundbite's going to stop sounding like actual words. But until that day, and on this particular occasion, it's well and truly deserved, as this video's gone through so many revisions, it makes Disney Marvel's production pipeline look like a robot beehive. My original plan was to make this a direct part 2 for my original Misfit of Demon King Academy video, wherein I'd illustrate my points about Anos by pitting him up against Ains from Overlord, Father from Full Metal Alchemist, and the Demon King from Seven Deadly Sins. And yes, I chose those opponents purely because they're from 3 of the 6 other anime I've actually watched to completion. But then I engaged more than the bottom 3% of my brain and realized that this was so far away from being a contest that the only of my original video's points it helped reinforce is the joke line that Anos is the otherworld version of One Punch Man, by which I simply meant that his whole narrative shtick is being contractually obligated to win in all circumstances. But unlike the Caped Baldy, Anos' victories extend beyond the scope of mere physical brawn. We've all seen the meme quotes from him by now. We've seen him walk off getting his heart ripped out, getting his source crushed, being unfazed by the time god's forced stoppage of all temporal progression in the universe. But very few people seem to know about that time in Season 2 when he fights the god of probability and wins because, and I quote, "there existed no possible future in which he could lose." So yeah, being broken by design kinda makes it an exercise in absurdity to use him in a versus match. Or does it? You see, where One Punch Man's shtick is based on his one eternally viable trump card, Misfit works on the logic of a multi-hour-long improv skit, with the plot continually yes-anding itself in an infinitely advancing spiral loop of logical absurdity. But that, you see, is the critical point. It is still logical. At no point does the show ever contradict its own continuity. It stays internally consistent. And upon realizing this, I remembered that time when Death Battle pitted Saitama against Poppy, and the former actually lost to the Spinach Wonder. The reason? Saitama's potential strength may have been limitless, but his actual strength at the moment of the fight was not. And so this got me thinking. Any fight with Anos would not be a typical test of power or skill, but of creative wits and ingenuity. In essence, you would have to beat him in an improv duel. But as Anos is also a mega genius who's potentially also centuries old, nothing less than an almighty sovereign with the absolute powers of a god and a mind equal to the very cosmos itself would suffice. Fortunately, this is fiction we're talking about. Fiction has been around a very long time, and as human psychology has endured with only minimal revisions over the last dozen millennia, we can safely regard the bulk of our otherworldly stockpile as a singular species-wide continuum of that most iconic of playground pastimes, the power scale. And here's where this video's title at last enters the picture. As far as I can see, there are 3 main categories of factors that need to be considered to gain an accurate assessment of a character's relative power level: their build type, their MO, and their power font. For the first and foremost of which, the one that receives the preponderance of attention by both on-screen and IRL armchair warriors in my book, there only exist 4 possible approaches to personal combat. There's the performance approach, which of us has the bigger numbers, the skill approach, who can most effectively create their own advantage out of a given set of conditions and circumstances, the prep time approach, who has the superior risk assessment and management abilities, or the hacker approach, who has the most unbeatable exploits. As per my SOP, to avoid getting us too bogged down in the quagmire of nerdy paraphernalia, I'll let you pause and read the on-screen chart at your leisure. A key point I think is worthy of note before we move on, however, is that most characters aren't going to fall purely into a single archetypal box. Instead, it's best to think of this like a weighting system, where a character has X% of one archetype and Y% of another. E.g., in my own personal estimation, I would say Batman's build is approximately 75% prepper, 15% skill, 10% hacker, and 5% performance-based. Feel free to argue over if and/or why this is wrong in the comments. But speaking of standard operations, as any half-witted soldier or martial artist will readily tell you, all the skill and power in the world won't amount to anything if it doesn't enter your head to use it when the need arises, which is why it is absolutely vital to consider both the personality, the backstory, and the modus operandi of any character who's stepping into a death battle arena. How does this character perform under fire? How do they handle situations they aren't prepared for? Can they interpret the unorthodox? Can they dissect an enemy type they've never seen before? How would a character from a non-magical universe cope with seeing magical spells for the first time? We also need to consider that the usual death battle format, An unscripted engagement on neutral ground between two combatants with no prior knowledge of or history with each other is a very specific set of circumstances, and so success or failure within it doesn't necessarily represent the full extent of a given character's capabilities. Surviving a one-on-one duel is not the same thing as surviving on a battlefield, is not the same thing as running a special operation, etc. Just because the secret agent can also sneak into a building and whack a few mooks in the back of the head doesn't mean he'd be able to go toe-to-toe with a literal ninja from hell. That being said, if that ninja's never seen or heard of a gun before, he likely wouldn't think to take precautions when he saw a guy pointing a blunt pipe at his face. You see what I mean? And now we get on to what I regard as the most overlooked aspect of power scaling. Power source scaling. The vast majority of characters with superhuman abilities tend to rely on forces or fields or the like, as most of their depicted feats simply wouldn't be possible were they to be stringently bound to the normal laws of material physics. For instance, we all know that Jedi use the Force, Saiyans use Ki and Psychers, and 40k tap into the warp. But what if I told you that Superman's strength comes not from his alien muscles like one might most readily submit, but from an essentially magic force field which he generates via energy he harnesses from the sun. And in this same way, Viltrumites use smart atoms to do what they do. The Flash uses the Speed Force, Thanos has the Infinity Stones, Galactus has the Power Cosmic, wacky cartoon characters have Toon Force. You get the picture. Absolutely none of these having any basis whatsoever in physics is why I classify them as magic, i.e., the process of producing effects with no corresponding causal chain, aka nonsense. Something you'll notice about every item I just mentioned is that they all fit into one of the 4 on-screen boxes. These 4 fundamental fonts correspond to the 4 means by which magical, by which I simply mean metaphysical, energy may be obtained or drawn upon in fiction. Again, you can pause and read their on-screen explanations if you wish, but the TLDR is that they all basically work like a cosmic game of rock, paper, scissors. The mind's nothing without the body, which is an empty vessel without the spirit, which is just an after-image of the soul, which is a composite output of the mind's interactive matrices. And while in our world, the metaphysical aspects rarely contribute meaningfully to the outcome of a real fight, in fiction, where victory is the product of narrative alignment, not a character's native stats spread, it becomes necessary to quantifiably scale the abstract to the real. In less big brain speak, if a character comes from a grimdark-style fantasy world where might is truly the only right that matters, then their power source is going to reflect that, and so should be weighted accordingly against a character from a more light fantasy setting where honor and virtue are the truest companions of victory. And this is where I need to delineate the line between a soul and a spirit. Put simply, the soul is what gives a being uniqueness, whereas a spirit, or animus, is what motivates them. I.e., a soul is the summary total of a being's unique experiences, while a spirit is the summary pattern of their desires. The former is funded principally by the logos, logic, reason, and knowledge, while the latter is primarily driven by pathos, emotion, and instinct. And as the latter are primarily functions of biology, and thus are the province of the blood, aka genetics, they fall under the purview of the essence, whereas the former are functions of lived experience, and so fall under the jurisdiction of the semblance. In my estimation, only the greatest and most dedicated masters of all can claim to be wielders of soul magics, as these require a complete interweaving of the logos, pathos, and ethos, which defines the overall character of a person. All 3 of which together describe, or more accurately persuade, the essential composition of the telos, or will. And that is the essence of a soul, a unique will of unique character, a unique and complex blend of mind, body, and life. This is why they are so often depicted as being uniquely potent, resilient, and dangerous. So, to wrap all this up in a neat little bow, the steps to accurately power scaling a character are as follows. Step 1. Get a measure of a character's base stats by examining their observed feats, while also taking into account any extraneous factors, extenuating circumstances, etc. E.g., if a character's been observed lifting a locomotive, which typically range between 50 and 120 tons depending on the model, with no outside help or power boosts and with only marginal effort, we can say that their minimum set strength is 50 tons. For those who aren't aware, the BFS weightlifting system categorizes strength potential into 3 boxes. Casual, the amount you can lift comfortably ad infinitum without needing to rest. Set, the amount you can do a single 10-rep set of before needing to rest. And max, the amount you can lift exactly once before needing to rest. And the rule of thumb is that your casual is 20% of your set, which is 80% of your max. Now, if a character needs help, or if they're unable to perform certain feats unless certain conditions are met, or without a certain item or equipment, then that goes in the circumstantial, not the base stat category. Step 2. Look over the length and breadth of their lore, namely their backstory, personal development, and combative track record, to get a sense of their specific conduct and overall temperament, and from this work to deduce a pattern of thought and behavior, which can then be applied to a future scenario. Example: a common hypothetical thrown around the Star Wars fan community is what would have happened if Anakin Skywalker had fought General Grievous instead of Kenobi. Well, in my personal opinion, Skywalker would have almost certainly died because his MO is to funnel all of his immense force potential into a headlong lightsaber blitzkrieg, which, while this tends to work on most occasions, owing to his aforementioned unprecedented affinity with the almighty Force, General Grievous has been specifically optimized to exploit precisely this form of attack pattern. With all 4 arms, the cyborg can unleash a hail of up to 20 lightsaber strikes per second, with his augmented brain enabling him to randomize their pattern, and his mechanical form granting him comparable strength and speed to what typical force augmentation offers. And while, yes, Anakin's far from typical, and were he to employ a force crush right out of the gate, he would finish the cyborg in one fell swoop. As I said, to do so would contradict his entire observable history. Combine this blockheaded approach to strategy with his emotional instability and overwhelming arrogance, and by the time it would even occur to him that he'd made a tactical error, it would already be too late. And step 3. Evaluate the source of a character's powers. Is their power source internal or external? If it is external, do they rely primarily on their source, their spirit, their mind, or their body to draw power from it? Moreover, do they have a symbiotic, codependent, or parasitic relationship with their power font? For those who don't know, a font just means an original source. I use that word for the sake of not getting the external magispheric planes confused for the integral source, meaning the soul. Speaking of the magisphere, it's also worth noting that some forms of superlateral power are more potent and/or unstable than others. Yes, you heard me correctly. I said superlateral, not supernatural. Why? Because nature, by definition, encompasses all observable reality, meaning that should something be confirmed to exist by definition, it must exist in observable reality, and therefore is encompassed by the umbrella of nature. Ergo, there is no such thing as supernatural. Also, remember to always bear in mind the stark difference between actual and potential power. Just because someone can theoretically accomplish something, i.e. they have the potential to do it, doesn't mean they can actually manifest that power in situ. See again the aforementioned example of Anakin Skywalker, the most powerful natural force sensitive ever born, who had the potential to be twice as powerful as his eventual Dark Master, but only ended up being about 80% his equal after sustaining the loss of nearly 70% of his organic tissue in the fires of Mustafar. And there we have it, mostly. It should, I think, go without saying that there's about as many ways to go about tabulating the minutiae as there are people who devote their own lives' minutes to drawing up hypothetical spreadsheets modeling the combative prowess of people who don't actually exist. So for that reason, and also because math is not now, nor has it ever been my forte, I'll leave that infinite trail of trivial minutiae open for the people more autistic than myself. And with that, I bid you all another thankful adieu for bearing with me this long. If you would be so kind as to leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't, I'd be most grateful. Also, if it wouldn't be overly discourteous of me to ask that you leave one of these trendy words in the comments as an offering to the YouTube gods, that seems to boost my notoriety in the algorithm. Though whether that's for better or worse, I can't yet say. And of course, don't forget to check out my alternative channels and social media, linked in the description. And if you want to support me but would like something tangible for your troubles, consider taking a peek over at my Amazon store and purchasing a book. And with all that, YouTuber Guff finally out and said, "Until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and remember, life's too short to take seriously. Peace be upon you."